Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the intersection of philosophical naturalism with paleoconservatism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So for today's episode, we're going to be looking at The Origins of Virtue, Human Instincts, and the Evolution of Cooperation by Matt Ridley. This book is from 1996, and it follows along some of the same themes that we saw in our last book, The Selfish Gene, by Richard Dawkins. He covers some of the same topics and some new topics as well. It's obviously written 20 years after The Selfish Gene was written, but again, as I said in that review, not much has changed throughout the years other than just additional, more specific knowledge about specific things. And that's actually one of the things that I'm going to be talking about a little bit in here is something that I didn't talk about in the last episode, and that is the prisoner's dilemma, which Dawkins talks about a little bit, but Matt Ridley in this book presents it in much greater detail. And well, I'm not sure about greater detail, but he provides more recent innovations, and Dawkins kind of stops at one certain point in the study of that topic, the prisoner's dilemma, and Matt Ridley gets much deeper into it, I think. So I wanted to discuss that a little bit, and also in this book, he talks a little bit about the division of labor, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit as well. He gets into other topics that I'm going to skip over. He gets into some politics at the end of the book that I was tempted to read, but I think I want to stick to those particular points as we kind of develop this argument. We need to start getting into the nitty-gritty of it and step out of the political for a moment and into the evolutionary studies. So the prisoner's dilemma examinations are really interesting and give us a lot of good information, and the division of labor. So let's get into the first section here. The first section that I wanted to talk about was the prisoner's dilemma. So essentially it works like this. In the last episode, we talked about the hawks and the doves, and there were different things that the hawks and doves could do and would get different points if they responded in different ways when they meet each other. And this is sort of similar. It comes down to a competition known as the prisoner's dilemma that has often been presented in the case of two prisoners deciding whether or not they're going to rat out their accomplices. But it's really more of a game theory scenario that can be presented in the form of the prisoner's dilemma, but can also be presented in many other forms of interaction that follow the same sequence of priority of responses. So in other words, you've got the two prisoners, and they've worked together on this crime, and they're deciding each of them in separate rooms whether or not they're going to defect and talk to the cops, or whether they're going to cooperate. In other words, cooperate with their partner, their accomplice. They're going to cooperate, keep their mouths shut, and both of them get off with a lighter sentence. But if one of them defects and rats the guy out and the other one cooperates, then the guy who defects gets the best result, and the guy who kept his mouth shut gets the most prison time. Or if they both cooperate, then they both do well. But if they both rat each other out, then they both do poorly. But they don't do as poorly as the one who cooperated with his partner, kept his mouth shut, while his partner defected on him. So you've got a hierarchy of different responses where the amount of, if you were to allot points, like points were allotted to the hawks and doves, then if you were to defect, then you would get the best result from the police. You'd like get no time served or whatever. So you get the best result if you defect. You get a good result if you both keep your mouth shut. You get a slightly worse result if you both rat, and you get the worst result of all, what's called the sucker's reward. If you keep your mouth shut while your partner defects on you. That's the kind of the sequence of reward from greatest of being defect to the worst of being the sucker's reward. So you're always tempted to defect, except that you know that if you both cooperated and kept your mouth shut, you could, over the course of time, you could do well. So they would set up all these. They had these like competitions of different strategies for prisoner's dilemma games, and what is important are which ones that won these computer simulations. The one that did really well was called tit for tat. It was a strategy where basically you would do the exact same thing that your partner did last time. So every time your partner defects on you, then you defect, because they would pair them up. You get to keep playing the prisoner's dilemma over and over and over again between all the different programs. So these long sequences of gameplay between two entities, basically, and then they would average out the different sequences of the two different strategies. And that tit for tat worked really well, but then they kind of started to say, well, the interactions aren't necessarily going to be just two entities like next door neighbors or whatever continually trading with each other and ignoring everyone else in sequence. You kind of wander around and interact with people on a more random basis, but not entirely random basis. So they started to make them more, the simulations that they would run these prisoner's dilemma strategies through, they started to make them more complex. And they found another strategy called Pavlov that worked really well. And Pavlov was basically that if you do something and it works, then do it again. But if you do something and it didn't work, it provided you with one of the two lower points, because they're in this hierarchical point structure. So the two highest points, if you get that, do the same thing again. But if you get in the bottom part, then do the opposite thing of what you did last time, so that it's trained by its environment how to respond, which is the same as tit for tat, but it's a little bit different. And so that one worked very well as well. And then I want to talk about one more here that he goes into some detailing, because those last other ones are interesting, but this is really where it starts to get real interesting, I think. So this is when he starts to talk about the discriminating altruists. So he's made a very complex or much more complex scenario for these different strategies and degree of complexity of the strategies for them to operate in, which alters and adds new dimensions to the different strategies and what is and is not successful. So this part is about what he calls discriminating altruists. He says the prisoner's dilemma is a two-person game. Cooperation can, it seems, evolve spontaneously if a pair of individuals plays the game together indefinitely. Or, to put it more accurately, in a world where you only ever meet your immediate neighbor, it pays to be nice to him. But the world is not like that. Reciprocity has a hard enough time producing cooperation, even within a pair. The pair must be able to police their contract by being sure of encountering and recognizing each other again. How much harder is it among three individuals or more? The larger the group, the more inaccessible are the benefits of cooperation, and the greater the obstacles that stand in the way. Indeed, Rob Boyd, a theorist, has argued that not only tit for tat, but any reciprocal strategy is simply inadequate to the task of explaining cooperation in large groups. The reason is that a successful strategy in a large group must be highly intolerant of even rare defection, or else free riders, individuals who defect and do not reciprocate, will rapidly spread in the expanse of better citizens. But the very features that make a strategy intolerant of rare defection are those that make it hard for reciprocators to get together when rare in the first place. Boyd himself provides one answer. Reciprocal cooperation might evolve, he suggests, if there is a mechanism to punish not just defectors, but also those who fail to punish defectors. Boyd calls this a moralistic strategy, and it can cause any individually costly behavior, not just cooperation, to spread, whether it causes group behavior or not. This is actually a rather spooky and authoritarian message. Whereas tit for tat suggested the spread of nice behavior among selfish egoists without any authority to tell them to be nice, in Boyd's moralism we glimpse the power that a fascist or a cult leader can wield. There is another and potentially more powerful answer to the problem of free riders in large groups: the power of social ostracism. If people can recognize defectors, they can simply refuse to play games with them. That effectively deprives the defectors of temptation, reward, and even punishment. They do not get a chance to accumulate any points at all. Philip Kitcher, a philosopher, designed an optional prisoner's dilemma game to explore the power of ostracism. He populated a computer with 4 kinds of strategists: discriminating altruists, who play only with those who have never defected on them before; willing defectors, who always try defecting; solitaires, who always opt out of any encounter; and selective defectors, who are prepared to play with those who have never defected before, but then treacherously defect on them. Discriminating altruists invading a population of solitaires soon prevail, because they find each other and reap the reward. But surprisingly, selective defectors cannot then invade a population of discriminating altruists, whereas discriminating altruists can invade one of selective defectors. In other words, discriminating altruism, which is just as nice as tit for tat, can reinvade antisocial populations. It is no more stable than tit for tat because of a similar vulnerability to a gradual takeover by undiscriminating cooperators. But its success hints at the power of ostracism to help in solving prisoners' dilemmas. Kitcher's programs relied entirely on the past behavior of partners to judge whether they could be trusted. But discriminating between potential altruists need not be so retrospective. It might be possible to recognize and avoid potential defectors in advance. Robert Frank, an economist, set up an experiment to find out. He put a group of strangers in a room together for just half an hour and asked them to each predict privately which of their fellow subjects would cooperate and which would defect in a single prisoner's dilemma game. They proved substantially better than chance at doing so. They could tell, even after just 30 minutes acquaintance, enough about somebody to predict his cooperativeness. Frank does not claim that this is too surprising. We spend a good deal of our lives assessing the trustworthiness of others, and we make instant judgments with some confidence. He poses a thought experiment for those unconvinced. Among those you know, but have never observed with respect to pesticide disposal, can you think of anyone who would drive, say, 45 minutes to dispose of a highly toxic pesticide properly? If yes, then you accept the premise that people can predict cooperative predispositions. End quote. Okay, so there we have a couple of interesting new topics: the prisoner's dilemma strategy of discriminating altruism, which would not participate in prisoners' dilemma games with other entities that have already defected on them at any point in the past. So you obviously start making the game more complex when you give them a memory for individual entities, these programs, but there's no reason that, that isn't possible. We can identify individual other humans and individual animals, and animals can identify other individuals and cooperate with them or cooperate less with them, depending on the past relationship between these animals. This is all talked about in this book. So these are just computer programs. And so these sorts of strategies, the more complex you make the system, the more these sorts of behavioral strategies come up. I mean, obviously, it's a scenario, a collection of challenges, and they're going to come up with some sort of strategy to defeat these challenges. And the more those challenges look like the real world, the more those strategies are going to look like real world strategies. But it's interesting because the degree of the strategy seems like that which would, I mean, the nature of the programs that they put them through will cause them to evolve. Like they will give them only a certain % chance of doing this strategy, and then there's like a 5% chance that they do a different strategy one other time. And so how do they work well if they are evolving, if these systems, and these are that's talked about a little bit in this book. I'm going to talk specifically about another form here. I would recommend getting this book if you want to get into more detail about all this prisoner's dilemma stuff, which is really interesting. But in this section, he starts to talk about conformist transmission. And it follows along those same lines when he says, quote, "Suppose that throughout human history, groups of cooperators have been more successful than groups of selfish individuals and have driven the latter extinct with fierce and frequent efficiency. This would have the effect of making it more important to be in a group of selfless individuals than to be self-interested yourself. It would work so long as the differences between the groups persisted, but would be fatally undermined if through intermarriage, for example, selfish ideas could spread from the selfish groups to the cooperative groups. Even if the creature concerned learns more of its habits culturally rather than relying on instinct, the same conclusion still applies." But Boyd and Richardson discovered in their mathematical simulations that there is one kind of cultural learning that makes cooperation more likely: conformism. If children learn not from their parents or by trial and error, but by copying whatever is the commonest tradition or fashion among adult role models, and if adults follow whatever happens to be the commonest patterns of behavior in their society, if, in short, we are cultural sheep, then cooperation can persist in very large groups. The result is that the difference between a cooperative group and a selfish group can now persist long enough for the latter to become extinct in competition with the former. Selection between groups can start to matter as much as selection between individuals. Does conformism sound familiar? I think so. Human beings are terribly easily talked into following the most absurd and dangerous path for no better reason than that everybody else is doing it. In Nazi Germany, virtually everybody suspended their judgment to follow a psychopath. In Maoist China, merely by issuing a series of pronouncements, a sadistic leader induced vast numbers of people to do ridiculous things like denounce and attack all school teachers, melt down all cooking pots to make steel, or kill sparrows. These may be extreme examples, but do not comfort yourself with the thought that your own society is immune to fads. Imperial jingoism, McCarthyism, Beatlemania, flared genes, even the absurdities of political correctness are all telling examples of how easily we can be rendered obedient to the current fashion for no better reason than that it is the current fashion. Boyd and Richardson then asked themselves why conformism should evolve in the first place. What advantage does it confer on human beings to be conformist? They suggested that in a species that makes its living in many different ways, it makes a good deal of sense to adopt a tradition of, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. To understand why, consider killer whales. Most animals eat the same kind of things all over their range. A fox, for instance, seeks out carrion, worms, mice, baby birds, and insects, whether it lives in Kansas or Leicestershire. But killer whales are different. Each local population employs a sophisticated strategy to catch its particular prey, but it is different prey in each case. In the fjords of Norway, killer whales specialize in rounding up shoals of herring with ingenious tricks of cooperative hunting. Off British Columbia, killer whales use a rather different set of tricks to catch salmon. In the sub-Antarctic islands, they feed chiefly on penguins and are very good at taking the penguins by surprise among the kelp. Off the Patagonian coast, they have developed a special skill which youngsters must learn of flinging themselves onto the beach and grabbing sea lions. The point is that each population does something different, and a killer whale from Norway would starve off Patagonia unless it adopted the local habits. Human beings have probably always been similarly local in their habits ever since they parted genetic company with the ancestors of chimpanzees about 5 million years ago. Chimpanzees, after all, show strong local feeding traditions, according to what works best where they live, almost as much as killer whales. One group in West Africa cracks nuts with stones, another in the East eats termites caught by fishing with sticks inside termite nests. Conformist transmission of culture is one way of ensuring that you do what works locally. You inherit a disposition to copy your neighbors. A Homo erectus woman from the Serengeti who migrated west and joined a band that lived in the edge of the mountain forest could do well to copy her neighbors in searching for fruit, rather than insisting on digging for some kind of tuber not found in her new home. Yet Boyd notices that imitation is more beneficial when everybody is doing it. Otherwise, if you are the only person imitating, then all you learn is what somebody else has laboriously learned on their own, not what has been proven to work by hundreds of other people. This creates a problem of how a conformist system could get started in the first place. In human evolution, then, the habits of local specialization, cultural conformism, fierce antagonism between groups, cooperative group defense, and groupishness all went hand in hand. Those groups in which cooperation thrived were the ones which flourished, and bit by bit, the habit of human cooperation sank deep into the human psyche. In the words of Boyd and Richardson, conformist transmission provides at least one theoretically cogent and empirically plausible explanation for why humans differ from all other animals in cooperating against their own self-interest with other human beings to whom they are not closely related. End quote. So there you have basically like the argument for localism and conformism, conformist transmission it's called, where if you are a wanderer and you go to one place or another place and things are different, you do best by adopting the habits of the people who are around you, who have made their particular presence in that location successful. So you just kind of go with the flow in order to survive, and that's part of the drive toward groupishness. It's part of the thing that holds cooperation together. The punishment of transgressors and the transmission of conformism. These are the things that hold society together. Oddly enough, but they're everywhere. We don't even see it sometimes. It's so much the default scenario. So now I want to talk a little bit about the division of labor. So he gets, slightly political, and no, I guess he really doesn't in this section. He talks about the division of labor, and let me read what he says here about that. He says, quote, Adam Smith was the first to recognize that the division of labor is what makes human society more than the sum of its parts. In the opening chapter of his great book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, he chose to illustrate the point with the example of a pin maker. Somebody not trained in pin making could probably only make 1 pin a day, and even when practiced, he would only be able to make 20 or so. Yet by dividing labor between pin makers and non-pin makers, and by further dividing the task of pin manufacture between a number of specialist trades, we vastly increase the number of pins that can be made by each person. 10 people in a pin factory could and did, said Smith, produce 48,000 pins per day. To buy 20 pins from such a factory, therefore, cost only 1/240th of a man-day, whereas it would have taken the purchaser a whole day to make them himself. The reasons for this advantage, said Smith, lay in 3 chief consequences of the division of labor. By specializing in pin making, the pin maker improves his dexterity at pin making through practice. He also saves the time that would otherwise be spent switching from task to task, and it pays him to invent, buy, or use specialized machinery that speeds up the task. Writing at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, Smith prophetically described in a few pages the sole reason why the material wealth of the country and the world would vastly increase in the ensuing 2 decades and more. He also recognized the alienating effects of too much specialization, writing that the man whose life is spent in performing a few simple operations becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become, thus presaging Marx and Charlie Chaplin. Modern economists are unanimous in agreeing with Smith that the modern world owes its economic growth entirely to the cumulative effects of division of labor, as distributed by markets and fueled by new technology. If biologists have not added to the theory proposed by Smith, they have at least tested it. Smith said 2 further things about the division of labor in society: that it increased with the size of the market, and that in a market of a given size it increased with improvement in transport and communication. Both maxims proved to be true of simple societies of cells, in this case a creature called Volvox, which lives in spheres of collaborating but largely self-sufficient cells. The bigger the Volvox, the more likely there is to be division of labor, some cells specializing in reproduction. And the more connection there is between the cells, the greater the division of labor. In Merylosphaera, the cells lose their private connections by which chemicals can flow from one to another, whereas in Euvolvox, such connections persist. Euvolvox can consequently pour more surplus effort into specialized reproductive cells, which hence grow faster. John Bonner turned from studying the division of labor in slime molds to bodies and societies. The facts prove Adam Smith right on the relation between scale and division of labor. Bigger bodies tend to have more different kinds of cells. Societies organized into bigger groups tend to have more different castes of operation, ranging from the Tasmanians, now extinct, who lived in bands of 15 and recognized only 2 castes, to the Maoris, who lived in groups of nearly 2,000 and recognized 60 different personal functions. End quote. And then he goes on to say, quote, returning to Adam Smith's pin maker, notice that both he and his customer are better off. The customer gets his pins cheaper. The pin maker makes enough pins to exchange for a handsome supply of all the other goods he needs. From this followed perhaps the least appreciated insight in the whole history of ideas. Smith made the paradoxical argument that social benefits derive from individual vices. The cooperation and progress inherent in human society are not the result of benevolence, but of the pursuit of self-interest. Selfish ambitions lead to industry, resentment discourages aggression. Vanity can be the cause of acts of kindness. In the most famous passage of his book, he wrote, in almost every other race of animal, each individual, when it is grown up to maturity, is entirely independent, and in its natural state has occasion for the assistance of no other living creature. But man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, when it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor, and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly on the benevolence of his fellow citizens. As Samuel Britton has cautioned, Smith is easily misunderstood. The butcher may not be motivated by benevolence, but that does not mean he is motivated by callousness or a desire to be nasty to others. The pursuit of self-interest is as different from the pursuit of spite as it is from the pursuit of altruism. End quote. So yeah, that's a rather long section there, but it introduces some important ideas. We've talked about Adam Smith a little bit before, but this division of labor that he talks about and the pin factory, it really is a kind of a fundamental mechanism of organization. And so in the natural world, we see, of course, the same sort of division of labor between different castes of societies, and even between different animals, particularly in social insects and other very social creatures, where different creatures will serve different roles. But that's especially developed in humans. And then the one last section that I want to read here is when he begins to talk about the sexual division of labor in humans. The division of labor between men and women. And this is very interesting. He says, quote, chimpanzees are our closest relatives. Most anthropologists believe that the first proto-humans, the Australopithecines, lived in societies rather like those of chimps, with many adult males sharing and competing for many adult females. There is no good evidence for this except that no ground-dwelling monkey or ape living on the savanna has any other social system. So let us assume for the moment that human hunting started for the same reasons as for chimpanzees. Proto-men went hunting for meat to offer to proto-women in exchange for sex. It is not all that unreasonable an assumption, and something rather like this occurs in Henry Fielding's great novel Tom Jones, in which meat and sex are closely juxtaposed. Indeed, in modern hunter-gatherers, it is uncomfortably close to the truth. In those tribes where promiscuity is common, men spend more time hunting for meat. Take two examples. The Achi are a tribe with relative sexual freedom. Women are free to meet men other than their husbands. Extramarital affairs are fairly common. Flirtatious talk is allowed, and different bands often meet. Promiscuity is not encouraged or approved, but it is certainly possible. Achi men are keen hunters, spending on average 7 hours a day in the forest in search of prey. Successful hunters have more affairs. The Hiwi, by contrast, are Puritans. They have a male-biased sex ratio, they do not like to visit other bands, and there is virtually no extramarital sex. The Hiwi men have just as much spare time as the Achi, but they spend little of it hunting. A day or two a week for a couple of hours at a time. The meat they get goes to their families. In Africa, a similar contrast is found in the Hasda and the Kung. The Hasda men are obsessive hunters and promiscuous seducers. The Kung are intermittent hunters and largely faithful husbands. 4 cases do not make a theory, but it seems plausible to suppose that there lingers in the modern male mind a predisposition to respond to mating opportunities by trying to hunt for meat. Yet there is much more to human hunting than that. After all, meat is a staple food for many foraging people. It is not a rare luxury. The meat seduction pattern may have been the origin of food sharing in human beings, but it has evolved into something much more fundamental and crucial, an economic institution that is a vital part of all human societies, the sexual division of labor. There is one big difference between human beings and chimpanzees, and that is the institution we call marriage. In virtually all human cultures, including hunter-gatherer societies, males monopolize their mates, and vice versa. Even if he ends up with more than one wife, as a few men do in hunter-gatherer bands, each man enters into a long-term relationship with each woman who bears his children. Unlike a male chimpanzee, who mostly loses interest in a female as soon as she is no longer in estrus, the man remains in close and jealous sexual union with his wife for many years, if not for the rest of his life. Long-term pair bonds are not a cultural construct of our particular society. They are a habit universal to our species. As a consequence, there is a different motive for male hunting. A man can go hunting to get food for his children, just as a male hawk or a fox does. This only increases the advantage of the man hunting for meat. Living as he does in a pair bond, the man can share all his meat with his wife, who can share all her vegetables with him. Both are better off. The division of labor is born. Each half of the trading partner is better off than it would be on its own. The woman can gather enough roots, berries, fruits, and nuts for 2, while the man catches a pig or a rabbit, then gives the stew a rich mix of proteins and vitamins. 40 years ago, anthropologists noticed that a sexual division of labor was part of virtually all human societies. In the 1960s, squeamish at the sexism this implied, they dropped the subject and blamed the difference on patriarchal prejudice. But that explanation will not wash. A sexual division of labor is not a symptom of prejudice. It occurs in the most egalitarian societies. Anthropologists are virtually unanimous in agreeing that hunter-gatherers are less sexist than farming people, and women are less dominated, but they are equally unanimous in noticing an allocation of different foraging roles to men and women. Men and women segregate their jobs very thoroughly, even when they share them. In medieval France, the slaughter of a pig was a task carefully divided between women and men according to custom. The woman chose the pig to be killed, the man picked the day of the killing, and so on, down to sausage making by women and lard salting by men. To this day, women and men largely end up doing different work. Even in the Nordic countries, where nearly 80% of women are in the workforce, there persists clear distinctions between men's work and women's work. Fewer than 10% of women work in occupations where the sex balance is roughly equal. Half of all workers are in jobs where their own sex accounts for 90% of employees. The question then arises, when did male hunting change from being just a seduction device to being part of a deal with one wife? In effect, there came a moment when men gathered meat not just to seduce more women, but to feed their own children. One school of thought is that the sexual division of labor was a critical feature of our early evolution as a species. Without it, we could not have survived in the dry grasslands that were our natural habitat as a species. We were too bad at hunting to make a living by it alone, and the food to be got from gathering was too unreliable and protein deficient for our large bodies and omnivore guts. But put the two together and you have a viable lifestyle. Add cooking, which is a form of pre-digestion, enabling us to eat tough vegetables that would normally reward only stronger stomachs than ours, and you have a variable niche for large and social savanna ape. End quote. So there he presents the idea that it's essentially an evolutionarily stable strategy for men and women to perform different social roles. Essentially, this sort of codifies the concept of gender, because if gender is a behavioral strategy, and we have behavioral strategies encoded into our brains, because that's what he's ultimately arguing, is the sexual division of labor it's something that is useful and helpful, but if you examine the human body and what it works well at and what the human mind works well at, the male mind is better at targeted vision, better at spatial relations. The sort of mental models that are required for hunting tend to be the sorts of things that men are better at. This is reflected in our bodies, in our speed, just the hips of a woman are not made for running, and so the hips of a man are made for running. So that's a behavior built into our body. Men are going to succeed who have the mental capacity to do the things that correspond with their physical capacity. So behavior is hardwired into us in some form or another, and the concept of gender comes very much from behavior patterns that fit the physiological / psychological hardwiring of men and women living in a real world. And obviously, behavior is not completely pre-programmed. We're also very much subject to cultural influences, but cultural influences are themselves very much subject to biological constraints. So that's, I think, what he's getting at here, is you can kind of draw a line when you start to see the division of labor as being not all that different from some of these other evolutionarily stable strategies that they're putting forward in this sort of game theory of behavior strategies. The need for cooperation and reciprocity. I mean, that's kind of what is developed out of tit for tat and developed out of discriminating altruism and these other strategies, and it's the same thing that is underpinning the division of labor. So the development of these cooperative tactics in a species that has a variety of different intellectual levels, physical strengths, when there's human diversity and the capacity for it, which is inevitable in a evolved species, these sorts of divisions are going to just naturally happen. And so it even becomes the basis of a sort of a society of, a diverse society, a pluralistic society, a society of different social groups operating under unique social norms, localized, fit to their scenario. It's basically saying that some form of human tribalism is inevitable to us. The divisions between men and women are inevitable to us, and ultimately it comes down to these ideas support a conservative worldview. And you can tell by reading some sections of this book that the author, Matt Ridley, is a conservative. He talks more about politics at the end of the book. I was going to read those sections, but I just decided that I wasn't going to. But I recommend you pick up the book and read that stuff, because many of these evolution-based ideas really dovetail into a lot of the conservative understanding of human nature. And that's kind of where I'm going with the show. So I want to thank you for tuning in today. That was The Origins of Virtue by Matt Ridley, Human Instincts and the Evolution of Cooperation. And once again, I bid you go to my social media pages or follow me on the aggregator, the podcast aggregator that you use, so that you can stay up to date on all of the episodes and check out many of the other ones that I've done in the past. They're all up on YouTube, obviously, and elsewhere on the internet. So, till next time, bye.